Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Think BRICS YouTube channel. I am super thrilled to welcome Dr. Pascal Lottaz here for the first time. And for those who have not heard of him before, he is an associate professor of the Graduate School of Law at the Hibuki Center at Kyoto University. And he he specializes on questions in relation to neutrality in international relations. And when he's not conducting seminars nor teaching, he's actually writing on his Substack, which I highly recommend. And he debates how neutrality continues to impact politics and economics worldwide, as well as do recent interviews and also talks about related topics on his YouTube show. Thank you, Pascal, so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start by first kind of getting the idea of the 30-foot view of neutrality, because I think when we talk about international relations, I think neutrality is a very underrepresented concept. So could you kind of define what the law of neutrality is and kind of the historical origins from where it comes from?
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I love that topic very much because it's what I mainly researched. And let me take this question apart. On the one hand, we have what you just introduced, which is the law of neutrality, and that is a part of international law. International law is made up of different parts, and you might be familiar with international humanitarian law. That is the law in war. Once war breaks out, or today we don't call it war, we call it international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict. Once that's the case, then that body of international law kicks in, and that's why when you break that part of law, then we usually talk about war crimes. So targeting civilians is not allowed under humanitarian law. Therefore, if that happens, it's called a war crime. So then we have different such branches of international law, and the law of neutrality is one branch that deals with with what neutral parties to a conflict can and cannot do with belligerents, and what belligerents can and cannot do with neutrals. Now, this body of law is also quite old, several hundred years, and it goes back 900 years to maritime law, actually, in the Mediterranean. And well, that part of the law developed over time and had kind of its pinnacle in the late 19th century at the two Hague conferences of 1899 and 1907. There, a lot of treaty law was created. And when people talk about the Hague rules, that's what they usually refer to, but it goes further than that. But let's set this one aside because that's the law of neutrality. But then we have neutrality developments in international relations and world politics, which go far beyond what just the law says and include things like, let's say, the non-aligned movement. It includes states that simply state that they do not want to be part of one or the other bloc during confrontation. This is where I would also count, BRICS as part of that conversation. Although here we are not talking about a lawful concept, we are talking about a way in which states try to maintain an arm's length distance to the conflicts of others. So I encourage people to think of neutrality in the political sense as a triangle. You have one conflict party, another conflict party, and then you have the neutral party that is trying to just remain friends with both of the belligerents at the same time. And that kind of constellation then always leads to the same problem, which is that both belligerents will put pressure on the neutral to be more on their side, and the neutral constantly needs to explain to both of them, look, I understand that you're at war. I understand that you're having a trade war or whatnot, but I don't give a damn. I'm going to do my thing, which is good for me. And I'm going to explain to both of you why, in my view, it makes no sense that you put all of this pressure on me. And this is a constant struggle, which we often forget to look at when we try to analyze conflict, because we usually look at the parties fighting, not at the ones that stay out. But the ones that stay out usually have a systematic role to play in the way in which the conflict then actually, is embedded in a larger context.
Yeah, you make a really good point about how the third party really is actually an essential part of a conflict between two parties. There's like, for example, the United States ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, argued in 2023 that you, quote, cannot possibly be neutral when there is an attack on the very values that we all hold dear. So you can see how, in a way that, even though neutrality is sort of balancing the interests between the conflicting parties, that one can kind of use that leverage, or how you define neutrality, to essentially advance your own national interest. So I guess in that way, what are sort of the benefits for states? Because we see conflicts emerging across the world. What are sort of the benefits from states that adhere to this absolute neutrality or this permanent neutrality stance?
So when we talk about permanent neutrality, then we talk about countries that have a neutrality policy on their books, and that can be either the constitution, it can be a law, it can just be a policy principle in, like, let's say, some of the white papers of the foreign ministry, right? Countries that just officially say, look, we are neutral in we're going to remain neutral even while there is no conflict going on. Of those states, we have a few in the world. We have the Swiss, the Austrians, the Irish. We have Moldova. We have Costa Rica. We have the Vatican. Then there's a couple more. We used to have Sweden and Finland that used neutrality politics and called themselves neutral, but they of course left that pool. Ukraine had a neutrality article in its constitution until 2014. So did Belarus, and they're very different in the way that they understood these neutrality articles or how they engaged with it. Serbia, by the way, I also forgot. Serbia is calling itself a military neutral. So what the benefit for these countries is that they have a foreign policy tool that they can use in order to communicate to other states, look, this is what you can expect of us, and we while we will have economic interactions with everybody as far as they wish to go, we will not participate in military actions of others. So unless we are attacked, we will not have any kind of war. Whereas states that don't have such principles, they often they join one or the other military alliance, or they join ad hoc coalitions. I mean, think of the coalition of the willing against the Iraq war, where the United States just started collecting countries that want to participate because the Germans stood in the way of this to be an entire NATO mission, about which the Americans were very bitter and very angry at the Germans. But back then in 2003, the Germans did stay their ground, and they said, like, no, this cannot be a NATO mission against Iraq. But so the Americans started collecting countries, and a lot joined, right? And funnily enough, even Costa Rica joined, even though just Costa Rica has no army and has a neutrality article on its in its, I think it was the constitution. And then a international lawyer actually sued his government in Costa Rica, and then the Supreme Court said, "Oh yes, that's right. We are officially neutral. Therefore, government, you have to withdraw." And they did. Costa Rica. He managed to get Costa Rica out of the coalition of the willing because. Because this principle was there on the statutes. So this is one of these success stories, which also shows the power of having a proper neutrality article either in the constitution or in the laws, because it then allows for also citizens and the larger political process to restrain countries. Even though in the case of Costa Rica, it had no impact on the military situation, but it had an impact on the propaganda front.
Right. Yeah, and you make a good point about how countries are kind of perpetuating this narrative that the wars or conflicts are so-called necessary, really, for certain conflicts that we really see today. And you actually made a good point about NATO, because I want to transition into NATO, because we really see it in the news recently, especially with regards to Ukraine and with the increase in military spending. But when we talk about NATO, Russia in particular really seems NATO to be the driving force of the conflict in Ukraine. But when we look inside NATO, there are a lot of, I guess, different forces really. we talk about the United States has a different stance in Germany too, with respect to like Hungary, for example. So I guess when you or Hungary and Turkey. So when you consider these countries within this bloc, this NATO bloc, are all these countries all responsible for the conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine now, or are the countries within NATO more responsible than others here?
There are clearly countries that are more responsible for this. I mean, it's there's no question about the overarching role of the United States. That goes back a long time. I mean, in 2008, the now infamous Bucharest summit, at which NATO membership was promised to Ukraine and Georgia. That promise was the idea and happened on the insistence of the United States. It was George Bush Jr. who one of in the last year of his presidency just insisted utterly, completely that this promise be given. And the Germans didn't want to do it. The French didn't want to do it. About the Brits, I don't know, but the Germans and the French, they both opposed this heavily. And in the end, they gave in. And within a couple of months, we had the Saakashvili in Georgia testing that promise and actually launching an attack against Abkhazia and South Ossetia, to which then the Russians and those forces reacted. And until this day, the West pretends that it was a Russian attack. It wasn't. It was first and foremost a Georgian attack. And you can just see how things spiraled to where they are today. At least since 2008, right? Since that promise. I mean, it goes back to 2007 and Vladimir Putin's speech in the Munich Security Conference, and there's roots even before that. But when we look at this structural role, it's no question that the United States is the heavyweight of that thing. I mean, the United States in NATO is what the Soviet Union was in the Warsaw Pact. It's like, yes, every once in a while, Poland, Hungary, and Romania, Bulgaria managed to kind of fend off a couple of Soviet ideas in the Warsaw Pact, but usually they don't. I mean, they just have to follow. And it's very, very similar right now in NATO. When the top dog speaks, the satellites have to follow, and the poodles need to go along. And this got stronger over time. So the U.S. role today is, especially in the war against Ukraine, is so strong that the U.S. has had a command post in Germany, in Wiesbaden. And even the New York Times wrote about it, from where they coordinate all of the attacks that then the Ukrainians would implement against the Russian forces, and they decide on the strike targets, they decide on what kind of weaponry is being used, they transmit that, and then the Ukrainians implement. It's utterly insane. That's why this entire war is, some people call it a proxy war, others a coalition war. Alexander Mercuris does that. It's a good way of conceptualizing what's happening. This is really, Ukraine at this point is really just the implementation partner of a NATO war with Russia. And it's highly problematic. It's super problematic, and you see it again right now. The role of the United States in the Hague meeting, the summit, the NATO summit that just happened the last 2 days, in which the United States decided it wants everybody to spend more money. So it ordered that everybody has to pay 5% of GDP, and that's now the goal. That became the target. And now European states will spend more than twice as much on defense matters. And of course, they will purchase large parts of that from the United States. So the US is able to order European states to buy more of their of products from their military-industrial complex. Spain didn't really want to go along, but was forced in the end to do so. We know that Hungary isn't happy about what's happening, but they go along. The Turks also, when it comes to spending, okay, they do it. It's not one single bloc. Especially Turkey and a couple of others are able to have more or less independent foreign policies and security policies, but other countries are just strung along very, very strongly, even politically. I think if we look at the different members, Turkey is probably the most independent one of the others, and the only one that's kind of able to use NATO in order to have its own balancing game going on. But many of the other members are just being, they are integrated in NATO in order to be ordered around, and a lot of them just go along with it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because when we think about countries like Finland and Sweden who actually recently joined NATO, we can see that because of the recent agreement to increase defense spending by 5%, many citizens would argue that their security and that autonomy is basically removed now that we have this agreement within NATO, and seeing how NATO is being used in areas like Ukraine and even wanting to extend into an Asian region for a later point in time. But obviously, they don't want to do that because they'll know they'll be so outstretched in doing so. But I want to actually get back to your point because Turkey is an interesting case because when we see a country like Germany that is so entrenched in NATO itself that it's willing to put ballistic missiles right next to its border in Russia, knowing the consequences of doing so and knowing the impact it will have on their citizens, Turkey's able to balance their national interests with the interests of a collective security agreement. What do you think this is? Where do you think Turkey has gotten it right? Where countries kind of in Germany and recently ones in like Finland, Sweden are really getting it wrong here?
Well, one thing is Turkey. Turkey has a history of balancing these different powers against each other. It did so in the Second World War. It did so after the First World War. The Ottoman Empire that collapsed. We have to go a little bit further back into the 19th century, but certainly during the Second World War, and Turkey just constantly made sure that it tries to play with both parties. And now that it is part of NATO, it is the one that maintained the most lateral freedom because it also still had like military to military relationship with Russia for the longest time until 2022. It didn't completely it didn't fully become also an ideological member of this alliance. A lot of the rest of these countries are European countries that see themselves as in a certain ideological way. And Turkey, maybe also because it was kept out of the European Union, it's been kept waiting for over 50 years, on the doorsteps of the Union, and was never let in, and was also made to understand very clearly that the Europeans kind of, they even if they don't hate Turkey, they don't like Turkey, and they let them understand that. And I do think this impacted the way that the Turks also see their own role and their own security. They are aware that while they share or are able to get benefits out of NATO, they have open conflicts. I mean, let's not forget Cyprus, right? And the Turkish role in this conflict in Cyprus, this part of the island being under de facto Turkish control, and Cyprus then becoming an EU member, therefore the EU importing that conflict with Turkey. So while they are members of the same alliance, there's also still open, covered hostility against each other. And so in a sense, Turkey is a good example for how NATO actually helps to manage conflict in this sense between Turkey and other NATO members, also between Turkey and Greece and so on. These conflicts are still there. They are managed also because of the alliance, and I would say that is a good function. That's actually one of the few stabilizing functions that NATO has for the internal cohesion of its members. But when it comes to external relations, then NATO, ever since 1999, since the bombing of Serbia, has become a very destructive force that is used as a power projection tool of the Americans, also a power projection tool of some elites within the European Union, the Ursula von der Leyen, etc., who want to have a geopolitical approach to the European Union, as second tier members. So NATO is not black and white, and I think Turkey is a good example of that.
Yeah, you actually make a really good point about, like you said, NATO not being black and white, Turkey obviously being a good example of that. And I think we can really kind of apply this with international relations in general, right? Like not everyone is within a collective security organization. There are always going to be dynamics between different nations. No one is ever going to really agree on anything, but it is the point of coming to a consensus and reaching an agreement that is for our mutual benefit that kind of helps us move forward, right? That progresses us in an economic and a security perspective. It doesn't necessarily need to always devolve into conflict. And a good example of this is when we kind of think about with two founding BRICS countries, China and India. They've often had conflicts at their border. It's never gotten to war. It's always been resolved in a diplomatic manner. So, how do you think countries in BRICS really are addressing kind of the diplomatic means of resolving conflict as opposed to NATO countries in the case of Ukraine?
That's a very good example as well. I mean, China, India, other Pacific states have been very successful actually in managing conflicts, much more successful than the Europeans, because Europe and America, they often choose to go to war over trying to use more reconciliatory measures or trying to have some constructive approach. I mean, again, like the bombing of Serbia and so on, these things were not necessary. These were wars of choice. Invading Iraq was not necessary. That was a war of choice. There's so many wars of choices that the Americans and the Europeans engaged in that over the last 70, 80 years, we just haven't seen in Asia. And in the Pacific part, and we can extend that also to ASEAN, for instance, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right, which is a bloc of 10 countries, soon to be 11, and some of them have internal problems, right? Singapore and Malaysia for a long time had like very strong disputes to the point where war was a possibility, but they managed those in the 70s, they managed them in the 80s, and they ameliorated them over time to the point where today Malaysia and Singapore are having cordial relationship with each other, luckily, and they're cooperating, collaborating. Each one of them does their own thing, but they still collaborate under a framework. And we see the same now happening with BRICS. To me, BRICS is the closest club of countries that could be compared to the way BRICS functions, I think, is ASEAN. Although ASEAN is more centralized, not centralized, but more formalized. BRICS, of course, not having a secretariat and so on yet, is still a more informal club, but it is the same principle that you do not try to give up sovereignty into the next higher institution like the European Union is doing. You are accepting that each state maintains their sovereignty, and you also accept that you cooperate while conflicts remain. You do not try to bring everybody on exactly the same page as the Europeans or the EU is trying to do.
Exactly.
And you go ahead. You accept that you have even military conflicts, but you try to add certain elements that make escalation less likely. So for the Chinese and the Indians, they had a policy on both sides that they will not use weapons in that area. So you have had instances in which soldiers literally threw stones at each other, but it stayed at that. And that's, and then you try to ameliorate the situation over time. And let's not forget, China and Russia had border disputes, but they managed to wind them down over time, because if you give it enough time and you create frameworks and you create discussion groups, then you will step forward. And at some point, people will get ideas of doing joint projects and so on. And out of these projects of necessity, you will finally then have projects of reconciliation and healing. And that is something that the global South is very good at, and Europe and America is terrible at. They're terrible at it. They always need to make concrete structures with treaties and so on, and if it doesn't work under that, then they go to war. The global South accepts that some things you just leave up to time, and you make sure that it doesn't escalate, and then it ameliorates over time.
I want to talk about something interesting that you that you brought a point of, is the idea that these international organizations, NATO, BRICS, the United Nations, they all have within their own, they're not all going within, they're not all moving each other step by step. They all have their own national interests that all mix in and are exchanged with other nations' national interests within that organization. India, in particular, is one that's really interesting because India has long often touted itself as independent. India's foreign minister has stated that India is entitled to have its own side, make its own choices. It's not going to be quote sucked into its own axis. It has defense agreements with the United States. It's a founding member of BRICS. So how can a state like India balance what BRICS could potentially offer, but also the weight of countries like the United States and the European Union who think BRICS as, which is not true, kind of a geopolitical project to destroy them, really?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the most important thing is, of course, for India that it can use BRICS as a platform and as a forum through which it can actualize its foreign policy goals, right? And that's how all BRICS members use BRICS. Nobody participates in BRICS because they want to make BRICS great again. It's not the point, right? You use BRICS as a each one of them uses BRICS as a way in order to actualize their national priorities, and that's how good such clubs are being used in the right way. Because at the end of the day, the the motivation must always be national interest. And BRICS makes that very, very clear. We have this other club, the European Union, in which we are not sure about. I mean, it's going a different way, right? A lot of the elites within the European Union, they see the interests of the EU as an institution overriding the interests of their national populations, and they even agree with that. And this is now a huge source of confrontation between elites and local populations. Now, BRICS will never go that route because it is not made to. Its entire setup is different. Again, the setup is rather close to ASEAN, where the national sovereignty remains the cornerstone. And the BRICS nations actually say so time and again. No interference in foreign affairs. I mean, national sovereignty, equality among the nations, within the UN framework. And in this way, I do think that again, India will use BRICS, especially on the economic front, to try to push for its own interests, together with the others, where these interests coincide. And they will go separate ways where they don't. But that's the normal and sane way of international relations, actually. This integration, also with NATO, for instance, where it is absolutely clear who's the top dog and who's the poodle and the satellites. That's a very Western way of thinking, top down. You need to create a goddamn pyramid, and then the question is like, who's higher up in the pyramid? And that's a big structural difference, right, of how these international organizations work. And I do think the model for the future is the BRICS model, and not the pyramid model of NATO and the EU. And even the UN is more equally designed, despite the flaws and despite the fact that you have the 5 permanent members and they have veto powers and so on. But despite that, it's still more of a distributed system than what the EU and NATO are proposing.
Right. And just to kind of touch on kind of the recent differences in relation to with the recent 12-day war between Israel and Iran. BRICS in particular released a joint statement after the military strikes on Iran, emphasizing the urgent need for dialogue and diplomacy and upholding international law to resolve the differences peacefully, which obviously which kind of contrasts with the United States' role and also Mark Rutte's opinion, really, we'll call it, on the United States' role and it means on these strikes in particular. But I think when we're talking about the role of neutrality, and like you said, BRICS emphasizing the importance of national sovereignty above all else to ensure that every country has an equal and representative voice in the impact and everything that is going on in international politics. I think it's important to understand how BRICS can evolve and truly be more to be as inclusive and as apolitical, really, like we've been talking about, kind of as possible. So if I were to make you the secretariat of BRICS for one day, and you had the ability to design BRICS to achieve the means that sort of the UN has, and even and even if you want to include NATO with collective security partnerships, what would you really suggest for BRICS to do and to consider so it can become an international institution that can be actually reveled on and looked upon in the future, really?
It's an interesting question, but you're setting it up in a way that already would lead me to failure, because the whole point is that BRICS doesn't have a central secretariat. It doesn't have a secretary general. It actually works through a diplomatic process in which each country, designates a couple of diplomats, and the head diplomats is then a Sherpa, and these Sherpas. I mean, that's just the name, right? That's just how they phrase those. And they go around, they meet, and then they make subgroups, and they meet in the subgroups, and then they try to do policy coordination. More like the G7, they try to just figure out what do we actually want to do, and how can we do it. And then you have like some within that system who try to conjointly make proposals that they then give to their own heads of states, right? In order to say, like, look, I think we should move like that. Shall we? Is that a good idea? And then you have this network of people working together, and that's inherently a very good structure. So if I was involved in that structure, then I would think about more formalization. Again, ASEAN has a secretariat, a permanent secretariat, in Jakarta, in which they then have permanent ambassadors. So each state has an ambassador to the central secretariat, and that could make this policy coordination easier and maybe faster than the still looser structure right now. So maybe something like that. I would then also, but I would suggest that definitely this consensus finding mechanism remains in place, and you can see how BRICS is going through these exercises of trying to make itself a more coherent whole. Because one of the issues, of course, if you have a mechanism that's based on consensus, meaning that all states need to agree to everything, that also means each one of them has veto power, which means that the more members that you add, the higher the chance that at some point somebody will just veto stuff and you get stuck, right? You the bigger and the more successful you become, the more stuck you will be. And in the Kazan meeting, what they came up with is to say, like, okay, so we create two membership categories: full members and partners. And I'm not entirely sure like what partners can or cannot do, but it's definitely has to do with this veto power. But you see how they're trying to be very careful in reaching out and extending, also because there's so much interest in them, right? And you can see how they are trying to always add regional rivals into the club, right? The moment they added Iran was the moment they also added Saudi Arabia. They are trying to create a balance. Also the balance of interest, and that's a very good way to go forward. So I would recommend to continue doing that, and to then also on lower levels to create more and more of these talking groups in order to solve problems that maybe Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi, and Moody are not even aware about, but then bring them up, right? and escalate upward without overriding policy issues. So this more of these discussion groups, more Sherpas, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I honestly think you hit the nail on the head, and good on you for kind of answering my little bit of, I call it a trick question. Maybe I didn't format it right, but I think you completely hit the nail on the head. And that's what BRICS is really trying to emphasize. It is that understanding that regardless of the size of the country, each country has an equal voice that deserves to be represented and deserves to be talked about with regards to the issues that affect all of us. We talk about climate change, we talk about economic development, we talk about conflict and war. and all of their opinions matter. And the idea of building more consensus networks, like you've already described, is paramount to really getting, to building a framework where people can talk about their ideas and their opinions freely without feeling pressured by any overarching power in that international institution that may veto their argument regardless because it has a superior position like you would see in NATO, but you don't really see in BRICS. So continuing to build those networks of building consensus, mutual agreement, and reinforcing peace through economic development and prosperity is really the way that I think BRICS can move forward. And and I think that's a very good insight from you.
And I think that's also what they want to do. I think BRICS sees itself first and foremost as a platform for mutual development. It's certainly not a military alliance. It is certainly not a counterbalance to the West. BRICS is not looking at being an anti-West. It's looking at being not the West, at leaving the West behind. If these people are that stuck in medieval ways of doing things, then let us, the civilized part of the world, just move forward.
Exactly. I mean, I've always said that if the United States actually knew the opportunities that BRICS would provide, it would have signed up in an instant. But them and many the countries in the European Union are stuck on their ways for now. But realizing the importance of peace and prosperity for us all, because we all deserve a chance for development, is really what matters in the end. Just so we can enjoy our lives to live in peace and prosperity. And I hope that at the end of the day that BRICS will continue to provide that for all of us. And with that, I do want to conclude this interview with Dr. Pascal Lottaz. I really want to sincerely thanking you for joining us. This was an awesome discussion. I'm going to revel on your thoughts for a while now. I'm going to think about, my next article and everything like that, because you have given me some really interesting tidbits that I hope everyone else reads. And for everyone else, where can they find more of your research to dive deeper into your insights?
You can look at my homepage, neutralitystudies.com. There you especially also find the academic books that I and my group that we keep producing and throwing out. That's for the academic part. And if you're looking for more of current affairs and what's going on, follow me on YouTube, the Neutrality Studies YouTube channel, or my Substack.
Awesome. And please be sure to do so, because I know I do so as well. I make sure to always tune into his videos. And as always, thank you so much for everyone for enjoying this Think BRICS video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for future updates and to make sure that Pascal gets on for another interview. Thank you again, Pascal, so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Benjamin.